All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Stacy Gallin. I'm the founding director of the Maimonides Institute for Medicine, Ethics, and the Holocaust. I'm also a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University and the co-chair of the Department of Bioethics and the Holocaust of the International Chair of Bioethics. I'm honored to be here today with you as part of the Silvers Fellowship Program. And today we're going to be discussing unethical Nazi research. So, one of the things that people often say about bioethics is that it arose out of the shadows of the Holocaust. And I think most of the time when I lecture, people assume that I am going to be talking about medical experimentation. Now, 9 times out of 10, I actually don't speak about medical experimentation, but today I am going to be talking about Nazi medical experimentation. So I think something that's again often cited are these two big things. The first is that bioethics arose out of the shadows of the Holocaust, and then also kind of as a corollary to that, the Nuremberg Code, often cited as the constitution of bioethics, one of the first major codes of research ethics, was a response to the medical experiments that took place in the camps. So we know these things. They're again often commented on. And really, this idea that I think many people are familiar with, medical professionals, dedicated to healing, caring, and curing, who essentially participated in torture under the guise of scientific progress. That really, when the world found out about this, when we had this American military tribunal, the Nuremberg doctors trial, when this came to light, everybody in the entire world really, said, wow, this is shocking. How could medical professionals do this? But there was really silence. Why is the involvement of health professionals in Nazi medical experimentation not something that is discussed more in bioethics or in medical education or in any type of health professional education curriculum? That is really the big question, I think, that we keep coming back to. So there are some common myths that I think could really serve, to help us understand why this doesn't get discussed more. The first is that this was an instance of medicine gone mad, right? We had a few bad apples who ruined the bunch. These doctors were, they were crazy or they were power hungry, things like that. The doctors who participated in medical experiments were incompetent. We know that this isn't the case, right? We know that medicine in Germany in the beginning of the 1900s, all the way up through the Holocaust, we know that these were some of the best and brightest in the world. We also know that physicians were not forced or coerced into cooperating. We know when we look at the statistics that doctors were some of the earliest in profession to join the Nazi Party. They joined early and in large numbers. Um, Another big myth I think that people want to hold on to is that there was no ethical code among Nazi doctors, right? So as soon as we use the words Nazi doctors and ethics in the same sentence, automatically people kind of are surprised. But, what we've learned is that Nazi doctors were really the first ones to have a formal ethical training in their curriculum. So again, we're talking about a medical profession. We're talking about medical education that was among the best at the time. We are not talking about medical education that was incompetent. We're talking about an ethical code that maybe doesn't resemble what we know it as today, but certainly a medical code of ethics at the time that was being taught by competent doctors, that stressed really this idea of caring for the nation of Germany, and doing whatever was in the best interest of the nation of Germany. Germany as a people, Germany as a body politic, the health of the German nation was the most important. And whatever we possibly could do, whatever that was seen as the most important thing. And so some of these experiments were done to bolster the health of the German nation. The types of medical experiments that were performed in the camps between 1939 and 1945, at least 70 different types of medical research projects were conducted. So that's types, that's not single experiments. Were conducted in Nazi concentration camps with over 7,000 documented victims. Typically, these experiments fell into three categories. So the first would be experiments dealing with the survival of military personnel. The second were experiments to test drugs and treatments. And the third were experiments to advance Nazi racial and ideological goals. So remember, when we're talking about this Nazi medical ethic, right, what was being taught at the time, we were talking about really strengthening the health and well-being of the German nation, right? Looking at that as the main purpose of medicine in that particular, the German state. So each of these three types of experiments serve that purpose, right? When you look at it, right, survival of military personnel. You need the military in order to strengthen the nation. The drugs and the treatments, again, many of these were done to help the German military, but they were also done to help strengthen the fitter members of the German population. And experiments to advance Nazi racial and ideological goals. Same thing here. We're talking about how can we improve upon the Aryan nation, right? The Ubermensch, the people who were considered to be the best and the brightest. How can we strengthen them? How can we make sure that we can continue to make sure that these people reproduce? How can we continue to create a German nation that looks like what we want it to look like? So here we have just a few examples in terms of the category of strengthening the military personnel, helping them to survive. I think, again, typically when I'm lecturing about the experiments, the ones that come up the most often under this category are probably the first two, the high altitude experiments at Dachau. So physicians from the German Air Force used prisoners to determine the maximum altitude from which a person could parachute to safety if his aircraft was damaged, right? So of course, obviously, you can see how this would be beneficial to the military. Obviously, in any of these experiments that we're discussing, there was no informed consent. And the prisoners were used because they were there, right? They were guinea pigs. This is not a term that we would condone using today, but it is very much the situation that was at hand in the camps, right? There were experiments that these doctors said, these are things that we would not otherwise perhaps be able to do, but we have the bodies, we have them here, so this is something that we're able to do. And hypothermia experiments at Dachau, also known as the freezing experiments, where scientists attempted to find a treatment for hypothermia. Again, you can understand how this would be beneficial to the military when you're working with having an army in freezing cold climates. What can we do to aid them, either just in terms of, a regular kind of invasion, or if something happens and they're separated for whatever reason from, the rest of the troop, and they find themselves again in harsh climates. So we have, again, these are some examples that we have here. When we talk about drugs and treatments, I think here the most striking examples that we have are scientists using camp inmates to test immunization compounds and antibodies for contagious diseases. One of the things that I'm struck with the most when I see this is, the idea of here, there was no need, right? There was no pressing urgency to come up with kind of these immunizations or these antibodies for malaria, typhus, tuberculosis, typhoid fever, any of these diseases. It's not like there was again a pressing global pandemic or an outbreak or something like that. This was just kind of again, hey, we have people at our disposal. Let's see what we can do just in case, right? So when we talk about why is it important to study these things, and of course always being cautious to never overuse the Nazi analogy, but there are lessons to be learned when it comes to bioethics and when it comes to global health, public policy. So when you look, at COVID-19 and you look at, what happens when we are facing a pandemic, what the difference being, of course, that this was man-made, right? Again, this wasn't something like we're facing a global pandemic that, happened naturally. What do we do, right? So however, we can look back and see that, of course, what don't we do, right? We do not force people against their will, like prisoners or things like that, to undergo testing to try and find, immunization or antibodies or things like that. So, you can look back and you can find again instances of unethical behavior and learn from that, not a direct comparison, but when you look at this, because we are not talking about a complete lack of ethics, we are not talking about medicine gone mad, we are not talking about incompetence. And that's why it's important to understand the myths and the truths so that we can understand, again, what can we learn from this? What can we take away? And what can we use when we're talking about contemporary violence? So the last category would be racial and ideological goals. Again, I would say most often when I'm speaking about this, people tend to say, oh, Dr. Mendel. That would be the number one person on the list that people assume I'm going to speak about. So, of course, Joseph Mengele's infamous twin experiments at Auschwitz. He had a built-in control group, right? When you talk about kind of this nature versus nurture, the Nazis were very interested in genetic research. When you go back and you look, kind of what were they trying to do in terms of creating this better, more fit race that had traits that they deemed to be more desirable. So, how do you kind of scientifically figure out how you can take these traits and pass them down? Twins seem to be a very helpful way to do that. So these twin experiments were seen as being very important in terms of furthering racial hygiene theory. The other thing were sterilization experiments. They were done primarily at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück to develop an efficient and inexpensive procedure for the mass sterilization of Jews, Roma, and other racially or genetically undesirable groups. These experiments were horrible, they were painful. But again, the idea was how can we sterilize as many people as possible, as quickly as possible? And again, oftentimes, not just without their consent, but without their knowledge. So the question here, again, I think that comes up becomes scientific validity. Is there any scientific validity here? So science versus ethics. Can you separate them out? And I think here I have two quotes from Arthur Caplan that I think sum up this question very nicely. So the first is the question of whether any of these activities carried out in the name of medical or scientific research upon unconsenting, coerced human beings deserves the label of research or experimentation is controversial. right? When we go and we look now at the term research, we're talking about something very different, right? Injecting a half-starved young girl with phenol to see how quickly she will die, or trying out various forms of phosgene gas on camp inmates in the hope of finding cheap, clean, and efficient modes of killing so the state can effectively prosecute genocide is not the sort of activity associated with the term research. So, in certain ways, and forgive me because I'm a sports fan, so I tend to use sports analogies when I'm speaking, but it's a little bit of Monday morning quarterbacking. We're taking this and we're judging from where we are now in 2023, and we're saying, of course this wasn't ethical. Of course, none of these things would qualify as research, right? What they were doing is not at all any of the things that qualify as research in the way that we define research or ethics in the way that we define ethics, right? And if that's the case, then can you ever really answer the question of whether or not any of these things have any type of scientific validity? So that's one area that I think has to be always kind of in the back of our mind whenever anybody asks, well, was there any type of scientific validity? So again, for example, when you think of the scientific method, you think of the fact that using the scientific method as we know it today, you have to be able to repeat an experiment in order to say, yes, this experiment has scientific validity behind it. We will not be repeating these experiments anytime soon. So that's definitely something that we need to consider. However, again, when we think about this, we think about, well, okay, so should we not be calling it experimentation then? Should we just say that it's torture? Are they two totally separate things? So again, there's this idea that murder and genocide, right, differs from killing for scientific purposes. Why are we talking, if you go back to the first slide that we discussed, why are we talking about this medical participation? What makes the Holocaust different than other forms of genocide? The exploitation of human beings for the sake of scientific progress is a moral difference. There is a moral difference here, right? That is very important and needs to be addressed. So when we talk about this, we need to refer to this as human experimentation because to do so holds the medical profession accountable, right? We have to understand that it was precisely the people who took an oath to heal, to cure, to care for the most vulnerable among us who perpetrated these acts. So, again, to use a quote from Art Kaplan, the evil inherent in Nazi medical experimentation was not simply that people suffered and died. That would be bad enough, right? But that they were exploited for science and medicine as they died. So there's that extra added layer, right? And again, obviously, genocide is bad in all forms. I'm not trying to prioritize genocide and say one is worse than the other. This is different because this has the active participation of the medical community. And it was done under the guise of saying, no, no, we're doing this for the purpose of science, for scientific progress. Medical ethics here placed scientific and societal progress ahead of human life. So not only did these doctors operate with a medical ethic, the medical ethic that they were using placed scientific and societal progress ahead of human life. So when Telford Taylor and the Americans put these doctors on trial, he said, it is our deep obligation to all peoples of the world to show why and how these things happened. It is incumbent upon us to set forth with conspicuous clarity the ideas and motives which move these defendants to treat their fellow men as less than beasts, right? To dehumanize them. The perverse thoughts and distorted concepts which brought about these savageries are not dead. They cannot be killed by force of arms. They must not become a spreading cancer in the breast of humanity. They must be cut out and exposed for the reasons so well stated by Mr. Justice Jackson in this courtroom a year ago. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. Civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. This is a different level. What took place here is a different level than anything we have ever seen. And that's why the Nuremberg Code came about after this. Ideas were put on trial here. It wasn't just people. We have never seen anything like that because what took place here was so egregious. And yes, we have talked about a lot of things here. We have talked about ideas. We have talked about numbers of people, statistics, dehumanization. But I would be remiss if I did not end this presentation by bringing it back to the human who is at the center of all of this. This is my friend. This was my mentor. This is my inspiration, Eva Moses Court. Eva was a Mengele to me. Eva spoke a great deal about her experiences with Dr. Mengele, and she spoke a great deal about how it impacted her and how she hoped that it would impact the medical profession going forward. So I wanted to leave you with some of her quotes. She said, "To look back at my childhood is to remember my experiences as a human guinea pig in the Birkenau laboratory of Dr. Joseph Mengele. To recount such painful memories is to relive the horrors of human experimentation, where people were used as merely objects or means to a scientific end. I was just treated as a subject to experiment, not as a human being. I don't think there was one single effort to make us feel human. What I'm finding very difficult to understand is how any human being can treat another human being that way. So when I talk about ethics in medicine, I point that out. That did not only happen in Nazi Germany. That can happen in any society that values the medical research more than the human being that the research is conducted on. The simple thing to do is to say, if I were the human subject or the research subject, would I want to be treated that way? And if the answer is no, you are doing something wrong. You have to change it. It's not that complicated. Put yourself for a very short time in the place of your subject, and then you will get all the answers. So I thank you very much for your time, and I thank you very much for helping me to remember the individuals who this presentation and who all of the work that I do is dedicated to. Thank you.